Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back to the Lenko Show, the podcast where we discuss all things health and performance. Today, I am very, very pleased, very, very excited because I get to chat with a world-leading breathing expert, Patrick Mckeown, who runs the Oxygen Advantage program and has also written some very, very just incredible books. Which we'll definitely be talking about. And they are on the top of my reading list of recommendations that I would 100% advise anybody to read. You will most certainly get a benefit from it. So sit back, enjoy. There is absolutely going to be something you can take away from this podcast. It will be life-changing. So sit back, enjoy, and let's get talking to Patrick. So Patrick, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on and giving up your time. If you don't mind, just give us kind of a brief an introduction into your work, what you do, how you came into working with the people that you work with and studying breathing to such an extent.
Yeah, I suppose I came across it because of health issues. And I was a kid growing up with asthma and a stuffy nose and sleep disorder breathing. So it was in 1997 or 1998 that I came across the importance of breathing, but it was breathing that was never told that way before. So all too often we hear about taking big breaths and full breaths, and there's so many different ideas about breathing. But what I read in a newspaper article was from a Russian or Soviet scientist called Konstantin Buteyko. And he said your breathing should always be in and out through your nose, and your breathing should be light. In actual fact, he said breathe less air. So I used this technique to open up my nose, and I was able to relieve years of constant nasal congestion. And even though I've got a deviated septum, I was still able to switch to nasal breathing by using his techniques. And then I practiced slowing down my breathing and breathing less air. And this was something that I'd never done before because everybody was telling me to take bigger breaths. You hear it everywhere. You hear it in gyms, you hear it in yoga, you hear it in Pilates, you hear it on the radio, see it on TV. And when I started breathing less air, the temperature of my hands increased. But I also felt that I was getting calmer. My mind was being calmer. And I didn't realize that what I was doing there was by breathing less air, I was deliberately increasing carbon dioxide in the blood. And as carbon dioxide in the blood increased, my blood circulation improved throughout my body. Now, how on earth that has been missed from breathing instructors who were focusing primarily on the biomechanics, talking very little about nasal breathing, very little about the biochemistry. And that pretty much changed my life. But I was in the corporate world. My background is a degree in economics and in social sciences. And I was in the corporate world. And it was a couple of years later that I decided I wanted to work with training in this. So I trained in Russia. I was accredited by Dr. Buteyko. And then I come back and I focused mainly on people with asthma and then people with sleep disorder breathing. And then we were always working with kids and, the application for asthma for kids and also for dentistry for children. And then I went into more mind in terms of anxiety, panic disorder, and then athletic performance. So now we cover many, many different fields. And I just wrote a book that was published about a month ago, and it looks at breathing for so many different conditions, including functional movement, sleep, states, anxiety, epilepsy, women's breathing. Women's breathing is very much different to males' breathing, and that's being overlooked. So yeah, it's been a wonderful journey for 20 years and working with many, many people and seeing the results. But I suppose, Alex, coming back to it, is the application of breathing is enormous. And if people think that breathing is limited to fill the bottom of your lungs with air and fill the middle of your lungs and fill the top of your lungs, or take full big breaths, that's not breathing. That's a tiny, tiny little segment. It's really the depth and the understanding that we need to get into in terms of biomechanics, biochemistry, resonance frequency breathing exercise to stress the body, but also breathing exercise to recover. And what breathing exercises are more suitable for some people. So It's not that everybody can do the same breathing techniques. Breathing techniques can be fairly powerful, and for some people they can help, but other people they can hinder.
Yeah, I think I've got both your books here actually as well. For anyone that is listening, obviously, number one, The Oxygen Advantage, 100% recommend that. That's kind of top of my reading list for a lot of my clients. And your most recent one, I believe, is
That's a new one.
Breathing
Yeah.
Cure.
Yeah.
I think for me, like I've only just had, I got delivery of that last week, so I've only had a chance to really skim through it so far. But just looking at sort of the list of things that are associated with, like, fundamentally that filter off from the way that we breathe and the consequences of non-optimal breathing, they're just so, it's like an iceberg, isn't it? It's absolutely remarkable in terms of the impact that it can have.
Yes. Well, if you think of it this way, changing breathing patterns can influence all of the major disciplines in health. And it can influence, for example, the gastrointestinal tract, respiratory, the mind, movement, dentistry, anxiety, and sleep. And they're fairly big disciplines, even in their own right. And by changing breathing patterns, and the depth that we can go into it can be enormous. I wrote an article with two ENTs, ear, nose, and throat doctors, and we had it published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine about 2 months ago. It's a 10,000-word article supported by 160 references, scientific references, with the application of functional breathing for sleep. And for people with snoring, people with obstructive sleep apnea, people with insomnia. And that's just one domain. And you could write the same about improving recovery and heart rate variability. And you could write the same, the application of functional breathing for functional movement. So the question to ask is, can you have functional movement without having functional breathing?
Yeah. Why? Because, I mean, from what I understand, breathing is the most functional or basic human movement pattern we can possibly have in terms of activation of the diaphragm, actually drawing the air in, and then allowing the rest of our physiology to do its job. I mean, it's the primary reason. I think breathe about 20,000 times a day, 7.3 million times per year. If you're doing that wrong, if I ask someone to squat incorrectly 7.3 million times a year or 20,000 times a day, the consequences would be, well, I imagine probably a list as long as the kind of results of suboptimal breathing, wouldn't they? It'd be ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's more common. If we look at a study by a professor of physical therapy called Kyle Kiesel from Evansville University in the States, 51 subjects, only 5 of them had normal breathing. And these guys were 27 years of age. So they were young people. Out of the 51, only 5 of them had absolutely perfect breathing. And the rest of them either failed 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, or 3 dimensions of breathing. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has dysfunctional breathing patterns, but most certainly it increases in certain pockets of the population. We know in the literature that 75% of the people with anxiety, 75% have dysfunctional breathing patterns. In the asthma population, or even if a person had childhood asthma, there's a high risk that they also have dysfunctional breathing patterns. So anybody who is exposed to, example, trauma, chronic stress, if they have a genetic predisposition towards anxiety, etc. And also then in the normal population, it's about 20%. So it's still quite a significant amount. And Kiesel's study, he concluded that the breath hold time, you can screen for breathing pattern disorders in in an athlete population, in a health population. Simply have the person sit down, have them have, normal breathing for about 5 minutes, just allow their breathing to settle, and then take a normal breath in and out through the nose, pinch the nose, and time how long does it take until you feel the first definite desire to breathe, and then to let go and to breathe. So it's the BOLT score from Oxygen Advantage. And Kiesel's study was that if the BOLT score is above 25 seconds, there is an 89% chance that dysfunctional breathing is not present. An 89% chance. So in other words, the cutoff point is 25 seconds. We need people to have a BOLT score above 25 seconds. And people with a BOLT score of above 25 seconds, their breathing is generally in and out through the nose. Their breathing is effortless. It's driven by the diaphragm. It's regular. It's light. It's slow. And there's a natural pause after exhalation. And the good thing about it is that, it's not just about the biomechanics, but it's looking at the biochemistry as well, because even if you have an individual who is focusing on the biomechanics, But if that person has a reduced Bolt score, it indicates dysfunctional breathing patterns, and that would translate into disproportionate breathlessness during exercise. So they're gassing out too soon. So, even from that, thinking about what's the benefits of functional breathing? Well, if, for example, you were to do breathing through your nose during exercise, you can improve your blood circulation and oxygen delivery. The fraction of expired oxygen is less. So the body is utilizing oxygen better. You stay aerobically for longer. And that's just looking at functional breathing. If then we were to do breath hold exercises to stress the body, we can make adaptations to improve the buffering capacity. And this really falls into strength and conditioning. And I know that, maybe strength and conditioning coaches are saying, well, if this is really true, how come we aren't hearing about it? That's a question that I've been trying to ask for 20 years. Why have sports medicine scientists missed this one? And they have really missed it. How come they have never focused on breathing patterns? It's really amazing. They've missed this one.
Yeah, I mean, that's something. So I'm a tutor on a personal training qualification. We teach level 2, level 3.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much the detail it goes into in a textbook is just the pathway of air into the lungs and getting oxygen into the blood. And that's pretty much it. Other than that, there is little to no attention paid to how we breathe and ability to actually do it right and how to coach it. So, and I know in the sports performance world, I mean, I've been doing this for around 8 years as a coach, and the only time I've come across it is through, the work that you've done as well. I don't think there's anybody out there that's necessarily actively teaching it in the same way. Why do you think that is? And do you think, like, I know you mentioned about links with anxiety and the way that we're kind of evolving as we go. Is this something that's getting worse and becoming more of an issue?
Yes. In terms of anxiety, I'm writing a new book now at the moment. And this is I've got my own personal motive on this, because when I was in school and university, my attention span was dreadful. And I often feel for school kids, and it's not just related to kids in school or university, but people in the corporate world, people in the sporting. I had a racing mind. And if you have a racing mind, you cannot put your attention on what you need to put it upon. Your focus is affected. Your concentration, which is your ability to hold your attention on one thing, is affected. Your attention span, which is the length of time you can hold your attention on that one thing, is affected. And these are the most important traits that we as human beings need. We need it for every endeavor in our life. But social media and information technology has really messed up the mind in this space. And the mind has been trained to become increasingly distracted. If you look at people, even if they've got 2 minutes of leisure time, 2 minutes of downtime, they can't even just sit still for 2 minutes. They have to put their hand into the pocket, take out the mobile phone and look at it. Now, what does that say about the human mind? That they can't even cope with boredom. But there's more to it than this, because we need to have some control over our thoughts. And education has taught us how to think and trained us how to think, but it hasn't trained us how to stop thinking. We need to train the mind that we can hone our attention on what we want to hone it upon, that we're not going to be bombarded by distracted thoughts, that the mind isn't racing. So on an upside, when we train the brain, we can improve our focus and concentration, but we can also reduce stress. We can improve our stress handling abilities. We can reduce anxiety. We can increase happiness. So, coming back to it, there's a few questions in this. How come breathing has been missed? It's a really good question. And I think it was because breathing has been taught very haphazardly and not correct. And if you even go to yoga, looking back at how the yogis developed breathing, they never said to breathe hard. They said to breathe subtle, to breathe light. So what we teach is more in tune with yoga when it was originally developed, as opposed to if you were to go to some yoga studios and if you hear everybody breathing inside in the class, what is that doing? Because these people are not doing very much activity. Okay, they're doing postures, but they're deliberately following the cues of the instructor, and the instructor is telling the students to breathe more air. why is the instructor doing that? Probably because the instructor believes that the more air you breathe, the more oxygen that you get delivered throughout the body. We have to question that. That's not based on any medical physiology. That's solely based on opinion, and that's based on distorted information that was passed down. So, if we look at the basic, just even open up a medical textbook, and I would say that anybody who is teaching breathing, they should only teach breathing if they understand the basic physiology of it. And the basic physiology is simple. Understand the Bohr effect, understand the roles of carbon dioxide, understand how oxygen is transported in the blood and released from the blood to the tissues and organs. And if they even understand that, they could learn that in 1 hour, and that would transform the health of their students, as opposed to just banding around breathing exercises, taking this big breath here and that big breath there, and people talking about stuff that there's no background to it. And I think that has caused breathing not to get the attention. Like, I'll give you an example. I was at a university in Dublin, and I was going in to do an exam back in 1996 or 7. And I was anxious going into the exam. And I took a 3-minute walk, and I started taking these full big breaths for 3 minutes, because I believed this would calm me down. And I went into the exam hall. I was totally spaced out and lightheaded. And that's not an exact recipe for success when you go into an exam hall. I shouldn't have done it. It was entirely the wrong thing to do. But that's the information out there about breathing. How could breathing make progress in the Western world if a lot of nonsense is being taught? And it's time to break that down to realize that it has been taught incorrectly. And that's a problem.
Absolutely. And just on that note, can you take us through, like, how important is that sort of space between breathing out and then inhaling again?
Well, people with good functional breathing patterns, when they have an exhalation, well, I suppose even if we look at the breath in versus the breath out, the inspiration versus the expiration, during the inhalation, the vagus nerve steps back. So the inhalation is more driven by the sympathetic nervous system, more stress response. And the exhalation is primarily under the control of the parasympathetic response, the body's rest and digest. So if we want to stress the body, or if we want to relax the body, it's all in the exhalation. If you want to stress the body, breathe in fast and breathe out fast. It's a stressor. If you want to relax the body, you can breathe in soft, or you could even breathe in fast, but you have to have a slow and relaxed exhalation, because it's the slow and relaxed exhalation that stimulates the vagus nerve to secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which causes slowing of the heart, and this in turn would assist with recovery. So in the breath itself, the exhalation, which is the breath out, should be 1.5 times the length of the inhalation. And that's normal, because the inhalation during rest is active and the exhalation during rest is passive. And after you have a slow and prolonged exhalation, there should be a natural cessation of the breath before you need to breathe in again. But people with dysfunctional breathing, they often don't have that natural cessation of the breath because they're caught for breath. And they'll often say, I just feel that no matter how I breathe, I just feel that I can't breathe enough air. I can't take a deep breath. I can't take a satisfying breath. And if you measure their Bolt score, it's probably about 10 or 11 seconds. And these people may have a genetic predisposition towards anxiety or childhood asthma, or females. Hormonal changes can really impact breathing. So, I suppose, it's the awareness of it for people to pay attention to their breathing and to ask, are they breathing upper chest or are they breathing low? Are they breathing fast or are they breathing slow? Do they have their mouth open? And not just when you're sitting down, but if you go for a walk, are you breathing through the mouth? If you do light physical exercise, are you breathing through your mouth? Do you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning? If you wake up with a dry mouth in the morning, you're not likely to wake up feeling refreshed. And here, if we talk about concentration and focus and attention span, again, something being overlooked. Thousands of people who want to improve their attention and concentration are doing mindfulness. But if you have a poor night's sleep, if you have dysfunctional breathing patterns, if your mind is physiologically that the central nervous system, the brain, is aroused in a state of fight or flight, you could do all the mindfulness in the world. It's not going to work. It genuinely is not going to work if your sleep quality is drastic, if it's terrible. Because if you wake up after a poor night's sleep, it's almost as if waking up with a hangover. And mindfulness, you're not going to even want to focus on the breath when you don't have the energy. And if your breathing is a little bit faster in upper chest and you're in that state of agitation, again, mindfulness is not going to address that. So I think part of it, Alex, is that we all as human beings, we're limited to our own little silos. So the mindfulness instructor doesn't want the breath to be changed, because mindfulness is all about just, in terms of, and it's brilliant. Like, I'm not here to criticize it, but I'm just saying that we as breathing in this space, we're all focusing on very narrow domains, and we're not looking at outside of that. And breathing is taught according to tradition. Like, so my background is Buteyko. I could only focus on the Buteyko method here. And I couldn't start bringing in other things into the Buteyko method, because then it's not the Buteyko method. And that's an issue. But with Oxygen Advantage, I wasn't constrained by tradition. So we still have the Buteyko school, which is one of the largest schools in the world for Buteyko. But with the Oxygen Advantage, we have opened it up to embrace anything in terms of the breath that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that's so important to do because of the way that breathing is linked to everything else. I know you've alluded to it there in terms of, I mean, it's it's the first pillar that I tend to teach all my, so for all my clients who are listening, you are the person responsible for them going, oh God, you're getting on at me about my breathing again. Yes, that is Patrick. So you're listening to him now, ladies and gents. So it's something that I always speak about. First and foremost, you have to get your breathing right. If you want to be able to sleep well, improve quality of sleep, and then have an impact on your hormones, your leptin and ghrelin levels, to then manage better nutrition, to then be able to train to an optimal level. Because I think everyone kind of skips those steps and goes, like, especially for me as an S&C coach and working with athletes, they all think, right, it's just about lifting weights. It's about being strong. It's about being fast. It's about being explosive. And then when I go, hold on, let's take a look at step number one. Are you breathing correctly in the first place? It's kind of like, oh, right, really? Are we going as basic as that? But I think you've done a good job there highlighting just how fundamental and important it actually is.
Yes, but if the foundation is overlooked, and if that person has dysfunctional breathing patterns, their movement is affected. They're more likely to be at risk of injury. They're more likely to be expending energy inefficiently. If you have a runner, it doesn't make sense for somebody in a gym, okay, and they're doing physical exercise with their mouth open. Number one is the mouth performs no functions in terms of breathing. So mouth breathing is activating the upper chest more than having optimal amplitude of the diaphragm. And in terms of the human lungs, the greatest concentration of blood flow is in the lower lobes. So by breathing through the nose, you're harnessing nasal nitric oxide, which is helping to open up the airways, and it also redistributes the blood throughout the lungs. It also increases oxygen transfer from the lungs into the blood. Nasal breathing during exercise increases carbon dioxide in the blood. You know this because you feel increased air hunger. But it's the increased carbon dioxide that causes hemoglobin to release red blood cells to the tissues. So if you go for a run with your mouth closed, you're more likely to stay aerobic for longer. Whereas with mouth breathing, you're more likely to go anaerobic. Now, I know it's more difficult in the first few weeks to continue nasal breathing, but this is the training load. If you keep breathing through your nose during exercise, then your body adapts to that. And that's when you start to see performance gains.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something that I actually accredit to. I ran an ultra marathon, and I am not a runner by any means whatsoever. I'm not a runner at all, but I ran an ultra marathon based on one training run a couple of years ago after recovering from a leg injury. And I simply put my ability to complete that down to just nasal breathing all the way through, because I'm someone that I sweat an awful lot. I'm not necessarily the most fit when it comes to aerobic function, but simply making that one change for me, I put that down to being able to complete that run, and then obviously having advised clients to do that as well. Again, that's given massive results and massive improvements on performance there. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that the diaphragm actually plays? So I know in terms of sports performance, function, being able to breathe, I generally refer to that. It's almost like the lid of your core musculature.
Yes.
Like you've got your internal external obliques, they're the sides, your pelvic floor, transverse abdominis, your rectus abdominis, and then I think probably the forgotten muscle, and arguably one of the most important muscles in the entirety of the human body, being the diaphragm.
Yeah.
Talk us through the role that plays, and then the function that actually has, and the importance it has in core musculature and breathing.
So in terms of the breath, when we breathe in, there's a message being sent by the brain to the diaphragm. And the diaphragm breathing muscle, which separates the chest from the abdomen, moves downwards. And the intercostal muscles pull out. And this increases the volume of the chest cavity or thorax. And as a result, air comes into the body. So the primary breathing muscle is the diaphragm. Now, if we breathe through the mouth, as I said earlier on, we tend to activate the upper chest. So mouth breathing leads to abnormal biomechanics. Nasal breathing is absolutely key to help to activate the diaphragm. Now, in terms of activating the diaphragm, so during the inhalation, the diaphragm is moving downwards. And during the exhalation, when we have a normal and complete exhalation, the diaphragm is moving back up to its resting position. And what's called a zone of apposition is the distance from the top of the diaphragm after complete exhalation to the lower ribs. And it's the zone of apposition. It's this area which in turn is influencing the intra-abdominal pressure. And intra-abdominal pressure is the pressure generated through breathing that can help to provide stabilization for the spine. So for example, normally if a weightlifter is lifting a weight, they will breathe in and they hold their breath for a brief period of time, because as they breathe in, the diaphragm is moving downwards, the abdomen becomes like a pneumatic balloon, and this helps to provide support so that the spine doesn't buckle. So optimal breathing helps to generate more optimal IAP. And a good gauge of the generation of IAP is by having your hands either side of your lower ribs. And that as you breathe in through your nose, you should feel that your lower ribs are moving outwards. And as you breathe out, you should feel that your lower ribs are moving inwards. Now, it can be common enough for people to have greater amplitude of the upper chest. And it's not that we want to have 100% of the amplitude from the diaphragm, but normally it's about an 80-20 rule. 20% movement from the upper chest, 80% movement from the diaphragm during rest. So there are exercises then to help activate the diaphragm. We use, for example, different supports as well, such as a breathing belt. Well, it's Buteyko belt, and we have that surrounding the midriff. And it's all about the person breathing against the belt, because a lot of people don't have the sensory input. Now, you could use your hands there, but if you go for a jog, you want to be able to breathe low as well. And with that, it's just more optimal, because if you're breathing low, if one is breathing fast and shallow, there's so much more air is wasted to dead space. So to give you an example, imagine somebody who's breathing 20 breaths per minute. And the tidal volume is, we'll say 300 mil. So the amount of air that's coming into the body there through the nose or mouth is 6 liters per minute. Now, to find out the amount of air that's getting down into the small air sacs in the lungs, we have to subtract the air that remains in the nasal cavity, in the throat, and the trachea, and the bronchi, and the bronchioles. So if we breathe 6 liters of air into the nose or mouth with 20 breaths per minute, 50% of that air stays in the conducting zone. It doesn't actually get down into the small air sacs for gas exchange to take place. So that's how inefficient shallow and fast breathing is. So if the individual then was to breathe a reduced respiratory rate, but slightly fuller breaths, taking the air lower into the lower regions of the lungs. So for example, if they move from 20 breaths per minute down to 12 breaths per minute, and if the tidal volume increased to 500 mil, that's still 6 liters of air per minute. But when we subtract dead space, so it's 12 breaths multiplied by 500 minus 150, and that gives us 4.2 liters. So already the breathing efficiency is increased from 3 liters per minute, alveolar ventilation, to 4.2 liters, just by simply changing the respiratory rate and leaving minute ventilation unchanged. So this is another role for the diaphragm, in terms of optimizing gas exchange. So it's not just about functional movement and functional breathing, of course, go together. And we know that from the literature, 50% of people with lower back pain have dysfunctional breathing, 50%. So then you have to ask the question, what's causing what? But we also have to ask the question, is the person with lower back pain, is it the upper chest breathing and the fact that they haven't been using their diaphragm optimally, which has contributed to a compensation, which has generated lower back pain. And another aspect in the diaphragm is the connection between the diaphragm and the emotions. So as human beings, when we get stressed, we typically breathe faster in upper chest breathing. And back in 1996, a group of researchers, Travis and Dolliard, they looked at athletes who switched to nasal breathing during exercise. And they looked at their brainwave states. These athletes were able to achieve more flow states by breathing through their nose. And the nose is an interesting one because of the connection between the nose and the brain. And I've also looked at more recent papers that athletes with visuospatial awareness. So you can imagine an athlete on a basketball court or a football field. And visuospatial awareness is your ability to have your attention on the ball, but at the same time to know what's going on around you. Nasal breathers had better visuospatial awareness. And I think this is coming back throughout our evolution, because we were constantly breathing through the nose, and animals in the wild, they have to breathe through their nose. You can imagine a deer. If a deer is eating grass, so the deer is eating the grass, but the deer is also nasal breathing because that's the only way they know that a predator is going to come. So they're sniffing out danger. And human beings, we would have been the same. But unfortunately, we've lost the art of nasal breathing. And mouth breathing is absolutely endemic. You know, if you go to any gym, I would imagine that at least 95% or at least 90% of the people in there are doing most of their physical exercise with an open mouth. What does the mouth do? Nothing. All it is a hole, and it's a hole to allow air to come straight down the throat into the lungs. Inefficient, uneconomical, upper chest breathing, not ideal.
Possibly even more so now, given, well, pollution, air quality, and our inability to actually filter out quality air and warm the air as well.
Yes.
I know that's a big factor when it comes, especially colder times of the year, like winter. I know the nasal cavity plays a huge role in that, doesn't it?
Yeah. Like if you look at exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, and in the UK population, it's probably about 8 to 10% of the UK population of asthma. And then you will have another sector of the population who get exercise-induced bronchoconstriction but don't necessarily have asthma. So, for example, somebody goes out on a long cycle and they do an endurance cycle, maybe 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers. And all that time they are breathing cold, dry air into their mouth, and their airways are being traumatized, and moisture is being sucked out of the airway. The airways are cooling and drying out, and this is causing the airways to constrict. And then the person comes back and they have irritated lungs, maybe a cyclist cough. They just feel that they have chest tightness for the days following the event. The mouth doesn't do anything to condition the incoming air. And that's again where nasal breathing is coming in.
Yeah. And where can people start with that and improving that? Because I know that a lot of people, when they exercise, the go-to trigger is to speed up their breathing a little bit and start breathing in and out through the mouth because they feel like they're getting more air in and out. Where would you recommend that someone starts if they don't feel like they're capable of nasal breathing whilst exercising? What would your recommendation be?
Well, I'd probably say to them, start getting the mouth closed during sleep. You should never wake up with a dry mouth in the morning. And if you normally wake up with a dry mouth in the morning, you're more likely to feel tired. You're not going to be rested. So that's a really good place to start because it gives people just an idea of how powerful nasal breathing is. And switch to nasal breathing then during the day, throughout the day. And then when you're doing your warm-up and light exercise, do everything with the mouth closed. And if you have got a very small nose, small nasal airway, maybe get a nasal dilator. So we use nasal dilators. We have our own ones as well. And basically, they're just little plastic devices that help to open up the nose to allow the air to come in easier. Because some people will have a damaged nose and, you know, you're much better off using a nasal dilator to help open up the nasal airway instead of switching to mouth breathing. you would be surprised at the exercise intensity at which people can maintain when they breathe through their nose. And there was 2 pilot studies done by physiotherapists in the UK back in 2010. And in one study, they found that people were able to maintain 90% of their work rate with nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. And then the other study was 85%. So even though you might lose 10% in terms of efficiency, you're getting much more of a gain there. And in time, then you'll find that you won't lose the 10% because you will be able to do 100% of your work rate intensity with nasal breathing versus mouth breathing.
Yeah, I was going to mention, I think I remember reading a study on, I think it was rate of perceived exertion when nasal breathing compared to mouth breathing. I think were the athletes able to maintain the same pace, same intensity, same power output for, I think it was about half an hour, maybe I've got that slightly wrong, but their rate of perceived exertion from mouth breathing compared to nasal breathing, the nasal breathing, it was a lot more effortless for the athletes, wasn't it?
That could be Dalam's study, but that would have been after the athletes were trained in nasal breathing. So initially at the start, when you first switch from mouth to nose breathing, it can be tougher because the air hunger is stronger. But if you continue maintaining nasal breathing during exercise, then the air hunger diminishes over time. And then what's happening is that your body is better able to cope with a higher carbon dioxide in the blood. And as a result, your breathlessness is reduced. So Dalam got 10 recreational athletes, and he had them breathe only through their nose during physical exercise for 6 months. You don't need to do it for 6 months, but even 6 weeks. And then he measured them at the end of 6 months. And they had achieved a 100% of their work rate intensity nasal breathing versus mouth breathing, but they had 22% less ventilation. That's a huge saving in terms of economy. You can imagine endurance athletes, they're going for long runs, etc. You don't want to be wasting 22% more energy in terms of this inefficient breathing. And there is an energy cost associated with breathing. As we sit here and talk, about 2 to 3% of our VO2 is going to support the breathing muscles. But if you go for a walk, fast walk, it might be 5 or 6%. If you do fairly intense exercise, it's about 10%. And if you do maximum physical exercise, it could be maybe 15%. Now, if you have somebody with dysfunctional breathing, it increases that. So say somebody who is having breathing pattern disorders, there's a greater amount of oxygen that's devoted to supporting the breathing muscles. So during a run, it's very important that athletes are able to run efficiently with conservation of the breath, not to be wasting energy unnecessarily, because then they don't have the reserve. And nasal breathing will help with this, especially if they practice nasal breathing for a period of time leading up to the run.
Yep.
More efficient, more economical.
Which, as you've touched on, you can practice nasal breathing in your sleep, can't you?
For sure, we do it. We have the tape on every night,
Get some micro tape on and, train while you sleep. I think there's probably a lot of athletes that should definitely be doing that. Yeah. I've had to make a note of this because I know we're doing quite a big loop here, but I just want to circle back to back pain a little bit. I think I read in recently James Nestor's book, Breath.
Yes.
In terms of the range of movement and function of the diaphragm, is that something that can actually impact back pain and in some cases actually improve any lateral deviation of the spine, like scoliosis and things like? Can it have an impact on posture?
Yes. In scoliosis, I haven't looked into it. And in terms of, we haven't formally looked into back pain either, but we've just anecdotal information coming into us that people who did switch to nasal breathing, people who did activate the diaphragm with lateral expansion and contraction of the lower ribs, that many of these people with lower back pain, their back pain was alleviated. So this has never been subject to a formal study, certainly by us. There is certainly a connection there, but in terms of the exact data, I'm not familiar with the data. But at the same time, I think it's really worthwhile that if somebody has got lower back pain, start nasal breathing, because it's not just going to have potential for that. There's other areas in your life where you're going to get gains anyway. And it could very well, I would say that it's very highly likely it will also help with reducing lower back pain as well. And if you look at the work by Leon Shato, who is focused more on this because he was an osteopath, and you'll find papers that even, for example, pain perception increases when breathing patterns are off. So pain thresholds lower. The central nervous system is aroused. So, and this has been tested with individuals that if they were touching a hot surface, that if they were hyperventilating, they had an increased pain perception, versus if they were doing slow breathing, especially the exhalation, that it reduces pain perception. So people with muscle pain, people with fibromyalgia, and there's other interesting applications too in terms of muscles, because some studies done in 2017 whereby the participants wore patches on the muscles, and the patches were administering carbon dioxide into the muscle, which increased oxygen delivery to the muscle. And in a study with rats, sprawly rats, I can't remember the number of them, but their tibialis muscle was damaged. So an injury inflicted on the tibialis muscle, so it runs down the front of the shin in humans. And they gave some of the rats, they administered carbon dioxide through the skin into the muscle. And in the other group of rats, they were not treated with carbon dioxide. Then when they sacrificed all of the rats who were treated with carbon dioxide, their muscle injury had repaired. So this also would apply to human beings. And it's basically via the Bohr effect, that if you've increased CO2, hemoglobin releases oxygen more readily to the tissues. And could that have effect on muscle injury?
Very interesting.
Yes.
I think, because that's something that I think I speak about a lot in terms of recovery and down regulation post exercise, and immediately being able to get your body into recovery mode. So essentially, as soon as you stop training, that's the beginning of your recovery process, and simply focusing on breathing and improving your breathing patterns at that point. How consequential can that be in terms of actually speeding up recovery or improving the results you get as a result of the training?
Well, I suppose if you look at like a lot of the instructors that we have some instructors that are in the military and special forces and SWAT, special weapons and tactics, and then other athletes as well. And they track their data using Garmin and Whoop and Leaf and Elite HRV, etc., HeartMath. But there's a few different areas. Heart rate variability is a good objective measure of vagal tone, of whether the body has recovered, or is the individual in a stress response, or are they in too much of a relaxation response either. For the human being, we need resilience, and resilience is a balance of between the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest, and the sympathetic response. So we need that balance there between the two. We don't want to be in one versus the other. To increase heart rate variability, nasal breathing during sleep is absolutely vital. And that's something that we've watched and observed. So the other thing is then light breathing stimulates the vagus nerve. And this is whereby you could be sitting down for, say, 5 minutes after physical exercise, or 10 minutes or whatever, or during the day, and deliberately breathing less air to increase carbon dioxide in the blood. And that helps to stimulate the vagus nerve. If you go for a walk or a run with your mouth closed and you've got increased CO2, that also, on the basis of the increase to carbon dioxide, and I'm not fully sure, but I would be fairly confident that it also is stimulating the vagus nerve. And post-recovery after physical exercise, for people to breathe in and out through their nose, but to deliberately extend the exhalation. So even if you're feeling gassed out, take a breath in through your nose and have a longer breath out. And the more you can breathe out a slow and prolonged exhalation, especially driven by the diaphragm. Diaphragmatic breathing is helping to reduce oxidative stress, but also the prolonged exhalation in turn is stimulating the vagus nerve. And as a result of the increased acetylcholine, this is going to cause heart rate recovery. So if athletes measure their recovery based on how quickly their heart rate can recover, well, if you change your breath, your heart rate is going to recover than if you're just standing there with your mouth wide open.
I will say I have done the prolonged exhalations whilst running, and it is horrendous, isn't it?
Yes. Well, even post-recovery. So after physical exercise, when you're gassed out, it's going to be difficult. But even if you just extend them by degrees, so instead of the person just standing there gasping, you could take the breath in through the mouth, but even just to go and extend the exhalation just by a little bit, because the more you can start slowing down the exhalation, the more you can bring the body into recovery.
Yeah, because I think that's something that I speak to a lot of the footballers that I work with, runners that I work with, mainly games players as well. Like, if there's ever a pause in play, it's not a case of like stand there. And I think you can actually bring your heart rate down to recovery faster. There was the old adage from coaches of, if you're out of breath, put the hands on the back of your head like that. And it does not work whatsoever. I think the optimal position is to have hands on knees. And for me, I believe that, I think simply slowing your breathing down and almost trying to hold your breath a little bit, but consciously really like holding it in results in a much quicker recovery than consistently panting and trying to catch up, which I think a lot of people do, don't they?
Plus also for people who are playing football, repeated sprintability. There was a test done by rugby union players, and basically they divided professional, 21 highly trained rugby union players into two groups. And one group was doing 40-meter sprints in a breath hold, and the other group was doing 40-meter sprints with normal breathing. And they had them do the sprinting sessions for 4 weeks. And at the end of 4 weeks, then they measured their repeated sprintability. The repeated sprintability in the breath holding group increased from 9 reps to 14.8 before exhaustion in 4 weeks. And the group who were doing the sprinting with normal breathing, they increased very incrementally from 9 reps to 10 reps. So here is highly trained professional rugby union players. And like I was talking to one guy yesterday, he said, this is elite performers. If we can even get 0.5%, that's all he said to me, 0.5%. We'll be happy. That's worth it. It's worth our while if we can get that incremental performance. And here you have well-trained during competitive season. This wasn't during their off season, to increase a performance indicator in team sports. And it's not related just to rugby, even MMA fighting, because you're going to be fighting and then you've got a brief recovery and a fight again. Basketball, soccer, any team sports whereby you've got that brief recovery before you have to go full all out. That's a huge performance gain, and that was published. You'll see that Wuron's paper, repeated sprintability in rugby, and these are the same exercise that we've been teaching for 20 years in the oxygen advantage.
I mean, how much untapped potential do you think there really is in this, and how much could we see it change and improve? Well, not just basic general health for the everyday population, but like at elite level, how much could it possibly change from where it is at the moment, do you think?
I have no idea. That's really, to be honest with you. It's because it has been untapped. And yes, it is starting to get out there and innovators are using it. Like, for example, I know by the caliber of the people doing our instructor training. And the last instructor training, we had about 50 people all in total. We do an instructor training every 6 weeks. And these will be people coming from the military and people coming from the sporting world. But it's definitely starting there, but it seems to be starting more in the military than, and I'm not talking about the normal rank and file soldiers, it's actually the special forces. And that's where it seems to be. And even, with police forces, it's not happening with the normal police force, but it's the guys who are emergency responders. So this is where the innovation is happening. And it's kind of surprising because, well, maybe it's not, because if you think of all of the new technologies, many of them have came from the military. They haven't came from civilian life. Now, you could ask, well, surely Premiership football should be looking into this. They don't know of it. And the thing is about something, if you don't know what you don't know, that's, you just don't know what you don't know. And that's the way it is. But the military are more inquisitive and they are really tracking their data. And if I'm talking to elite footballers, they don't track their data to the same extent. So the guys in the military are all wearing Garmin watches. They are tracking everything. And they know then, by applying something, and that's it. That's the proof of the pudding. The proof of the pudding is put it into practice. Does it get a result? And does it get a result pretty quickly? And I would say 4 weeks, you will see results in 4 weeks across a number of different spectrums.
Because I think for anyone who's familiar with like the program SAS Who Dares Wins, Ollie Ollerton, one of the guys in there, I've read his book and gone through some of the stuff he's done. he talks about the first thing to do in any stressful situation is just check in with your breath. Like, are you breathing? Are you alive? Yes. Right. Okay. Now you can begin to think, and now you can actively make decisions and ultimately perform. So that's always the first fundamental step. And obviously, if it's useful in special forces,
yes,
surely it's going to be useful in everyday life.
Yeah.
I think the reason I ask about the untapped potential of it is because I think a lot of athletes, especially, or like train, and even, well, general population, we always think that training has to be done in a special environment at a special time to be able to get results and see the benefits. And when you think about, because I've done a few of the breath hold exercises where you walk and you essentially train your CO2 tolerance.
Yes.
It's not invasive in terms of it doesn't have a negative impact on performance the next day. You don't get muscle soreness. What would be your recommendation on how often should people be working on that and training it, essentially?
Yeah, like it's about understanding the techniques and bringing them into your training, bringing them into your everyday life. So during a warm-up, instead of doing the warm-up with your mouth open, we normally will start off with warm-up with slow breathing and low breathing. And this is also very important for going into competition because we want to steady the nerves and we want to improve focus. So initially we during the warm-up, we have the athlete go into relax the mind. And then we bring in breath holds, a couple of easy breath holds just to stress him a little bit or her. And then we do 5 strong breath holds. And that's for spleen contraction as well, because the spleen will release red blood cells into circulation to increase oxygen carrying capacity. So there's a warm-up. The person is already doing the warm-up anyway, but instead of doing it fast and mouth breathing and shallow breathing, which is not good, do it nose and slow initially. And then halfway through the warm-up, take a normal breath in through your nose and out through your nose and out, and hold your breath. And hold your breath for maybe 10 or 15 paces. And then go back to normal breathing for about a minute. And then hold your breath again for 10 or 15 paces. And then go back to normal breathing for about a half a minute or so, or a minute. And then do longer breath holds. So you could do these with any exercise, high knees or anything you're doing. During normal training session, if you're an elite athlete, we wouldn't say to go 100% nasal breathing. But there's different times that you will be doing nasal breathing during jogs and runs, etc. And then there's times that you want to go all out effort. That's mouth breathing. And if you're doing anaerobic shuttle test, instead of doing anaerobic training specifically with the mouth open, why not devote some of these trainings with mouth closed? It has a stronger effect. Or to do breath holds, and that has an even stronger effect. And then recovery post physical exercise. As we spoke about earlier on, breathing nose, breathing slow, breathing low, and that'll bring the body back into recovery. And then if, for example, you want to improve your sleep before you go to bed at night, you're watching television, slow down your breathing and reduce the volume of air that you are breathing to stimulate the vagus nerve, and to do that for 15 minutes before sleep. Then have your mouth closed. And if you're going out walking the dog, do it with your mouth closed and do some breath holds during the walk. And be bringing your attention into your breath, because most of the time people are stuck in their heads anyway. And they're stuck in their heads and they're lost in thought. They're drowning in thought and they don't even realize it. And they don't realize the negativity and how kind of damaging and the waste of energy and how it makes us feel, because we don't pay attention. Most of us don't pay attention to what we're thinking about. And as a result, we're responding to our thoughts based on this is true and this is fact. And, it's making us feel down, etc. And it's very common, most thoughts, it's been estimated that 95% of thoughts going through the human mind are repetitive and negative, 95%. So even just by tapping into the breath, bringing your attention into the body, and it's a great way as well to see where you are in terms of stress, because stress will always manifest in the body and you will feel it. And at any time then that you're feeling that you're stressed, it's time then to reset. And this is the beauty about the breath, that we will always be confronted with stresses in our lives. That is inevitable. And if people think that they're never going to have stress in their life, well, just wait, because it's going to happen sooner or later. But what I would say to you is to start focusing on your breathing when things are going pretty well. And then when you do come across a situation, it's a lot softer and you remain focused and clear-headed during it. Like I've seen guys who are living in their heads, and the smallest event, they go into an explosive temper. They can't deal with it. That's a racing mind. And the amygdala is on fight or flight all the time. That's no way to live. And not only for them, but even trying to live with somebody like that would be impossible, because you'd be walking on eggshells all the time. Like, I think it's time also, Alex, that people take responsibility for what's going on in their own minds. And it's just unfortunate that teachers have missed this in school. Like, it seems to be this session I've been giving out about teachers, and I've been giving out about sports scientists, and I've been giving out about, but the problem is the breadth has so much potential, but it has been overlooked by the industries that have the greatest potential to get it out there. School kids need to be taught how to nasal breathe. If you look at a study by Karen Bonnock in Stratford-upon-Avon, she looked at 11,000 British children over an 8-year period, and she had her results published in the journal Pediatrics, which is a very high impact journal. Children with sleep disorder breathing, of which mouth breathing is a contributory factor. If these kids were untreated by age 5, they had a 40% risk of special education needs by age 8. Now you can imagine these kids in school, they're there with their mouths open, the teachers wanting them to be attentive in class, to be able to concentrate, to be able to regurgitate information. Nobody's paying any attention to these kids' health. It's dreadful.
I mean, that's a ridiculous statistic in itself. It's crazy. It's absolutely. So I know my girlfriend, she's a teacher as well, and she's teaching year 5 previously. And she had one particular child who unfortunately had, quite an unfortunate childhood. I think he got attachment disorder, and a very lovely kid. And normally, and I asked her what was the difference versus, when he was having one of his kind of episodes, if you like. And I asked her specifically about the breathing and the drastic change from when he was being well-behaved, attentive, and focused on what he was doing compared to when he was going through, you highlighted there the amygdala firing up and that response. And it's very, very, it's feral, isn't it? And the level of behavior and the way you can communicate with that person, it's a very drastic change.
Yeah. But that child's sleep should be looked at. Yeah. But unfortunately, it's been missed. If somebody was to talk to the parents and ask, does the child have the mouth open during the sleep? Do you hear the child breathing? Is the child snoring? No child should snore. And that's well documented in the literature, that there is a significant relationship between ADD and ADHD and poor sleep in children. So it's just one of those things that breathing has been overlooked. And, it come up in conversation as well with professionals. We were having a panel discussion going back 6 months ago, and the same question came up. And we had professors, and we had orthodontists and dentists, and James Nestor was there, and other people. And my thought about it is, and I wrote on the book, the only reason that breathing hasn't been embraced is because there's no profit in it. That's why. If the industry was promised that they would make significant money from teaching breathing exercises, I guarantee you it will be taught.
Absolutely. I know we're running very, very tight on time now, but I just want to, before you go, I just want to get your final thoughts on, can you give us an example of a particular time or anything in particular that has surprised you or blown you away in terms of a positive result through training someone's breathing? Is there anything that comes to mind?
It depends on the areas, like we've seen reports with Olympic athletes that their VO2 max significantly increasing, and this comes in, and I'm not just saying it, but we get this is very frequent because we've quite a big reach out there. There's a couple of things that stand out. One about 15 years ago, I was working very much with kids with asthma coming in, and a 14-year-old kid came in, and this child was hospitalized every 6 weeks with asthma, every 6 weeks. And the kid was bent over, lacking confidence, very poor breathing. And I put him through all of the exercise, and he put it into practice. He never had a hospitalization since. And that's not an exaggeration. I've also seen people with depression hospitalized with anxiety and depression. and making a significant difference in their health, especially when we got their sleep right. Because again, you know, people with depression, oftentimes they've got very poor sleep quality, which is feeding into it. You know, yeah, like I've kind of, after so many years in it, you don't really collect stories anymore, and it's not genuine. Like, it's not that I'm going to say that this is going to help everybody. No, it's not. You have to put it into practice. But if you have somebody who's prepared to put it into practice, the benefits can be very, very worthwhile.
Brilliant. So get to work on it, people. Just before you go, Patrick, can you let us know where people can find you, where people can follow you on social media, and stay up to date with your work, and then also your 2 books, and any other book recommendations you would like to give out as well?
I've got about 8 books or 9 books, and there's books on asthma. Close Your Mouth is a popular one for anybody with asthma, or anxiety. There's one called Anxiety Free. I have 2 books for children. So if any parents have children, ABC to be asthma free, or Buteyko meets Dr. Mew. And then there's Sleep Book, and then there's Oxygen Advantage, and then the newest one is The Breathing Cure, and the next one now is going to be on focus. In terms of social media, it's our handle with Instagram is Buteyko Clinic. It's kind of the health arm, and the website for health is buteykoclinic.com. And for the sports performance, it's Oxygen Advantage or oxygenadvantage.com. So join us if you're Instagram, because we're pretty active on it. I'm not the best with it in terms of social media, but we've got a support team of about 11 people. So we have full-time people who are dedicated just to the social media too.
Brilliant. Patrick, thank you ever so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Sure, you're very welcome. Thanks, Alex.
Well, there you go, ladies and gents. I hope you've enjoyed that one. I think some of the key things from that discussion: number 1, slow your breathing down, breathe light, breathe slow, and then consider training it whilst you're actually sleeping. If you can do that, just get some mouth tape. It doesn't need to be excessive. You don't have to completely cover your mouth, and we're not talking about buying Gorilla Tape or duct tape or completely sealing your mouth shut. So you don't need to have fears from that. You can just buy some little micro tape, tape it across your lips to encourage you to keep your mouth closed whilst you are sleeping. And that's a perfect way to begin training nasal breathing. And then in terms of implementing it during exercise, consider doing that through your warm-up, just through some light breathing exercises, some light breath holds, and simply become more aware of your breathing. I think the links to breathing anxiety, and again, if you go through Patrick's new book, The Breathing Cure, some of the things on there and the links that it has to, whether it's asthma, dental health, diabetes, epilepsy, exercise, the differences in female breathing, one for the ladies out there, high blood pressure. If you want to read a bit about how breathing can impact your intimacy, yes, it can. Insomnia, general pain and mobility, any sort of panic disorders, your levels of resilience, snoring, sleep apnea, it is all in his new book, so you can catch up to it in there. And if you do want to find anything else from Patrick or study more into your breathing, make sure you follow him on his social media as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed that episode. I will be back again soon with more. Take care, stay safe, stay fit, stay strong.